that you enjoy them as much as I did. It is my honor today to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Anton Treuer. Dr. Treuer is the Professor of Ojibwe at Bemidji State University and author of 19 books. He is editor of the Oshkaabewis Native Journal, the only academic journal of the Ojibwe language. Dr. Treuer is a renowned international speaker, has presented all over the U.S. and Canada, and in several foreign countries on everything you ever wanted to know about Indians, but were afraid to ask. Both Deputy Shippo, Amy Spock, and I are parents of recent graduates from Durham Hall and St. Paul. And Dr. Treuer was a leader of the school's Dismantling Racism initiative, and so we really appreciated his work at our school. But I first met Dr. Treuer during the restoration of the Minnesota State Capitol, where he served on the art subcommittee. He challenged our committee to truly reflect on not only how the art in the Minnesota Capitol impacts so many visitors, but also on how we improve and give agency to the voices of those who have long been shut out of decision-making processes. In his comments to the subcommittee, he left us all something upon which to reflect with the organized communities. He wrote, "There is a tendency toward tokenism with regard to minority representation so far. Those included were mainly invited to deflect criticism about the lack of Native voices in the process, rather than to empower those voices with the ability to move effectively, influence the process or outcome of decision making. I always remember that as a challenge, and I ask myself whether a work group and its members are representative, but also able to work effectively to influence an outcome." I'm really looking forward to hearing from Dr. Treuer today, and so please join me in welcoming Dr. Treuer.
Miigwech, Kowei Majitaya Nimi Ojibwe Majines, Mieko Winu Bemidji State Naman and Individual Bajayan, Minuagoda, Winu Bumbi, Ayalian, Wagosh, Indigu Minua, Legacy and Dode, anyway, Wasawadu, Sholinga Wajibaya, Azam Swaji, Dajagana Shimina, English too. Yes, they come to speak. They didn't say anything at all about using a foreign language like English. It is weird to me, and probably just a manifestation of our shared colonial experience, that my language is one of the indigenous languages of this part of the universe, but mine is the one that sounds weird, foreign, and exotic when we gather in this company. And I think I'm making progress. I'm about to the point where the president and deans at Bemidji State University, when they receive calls looking for the Department of Foreign Languages to send them to the English department, and everyone else in the committee. I really rely upon people smarter, older, wiser than me who say when you meet someone new, tell them what your name is, your clan, and where you're from. So it's giving you a little bit of an Ojibwe introduction. My Ojibwe name is Wagosh, means fox, from the Eagle clan, and we have a clan system in the Ojibwe culture that doubles as kind of a symbol for your family and also a spiritual guide. And I come from Beach Lake, right in the middle of northern Minnesota. Pictured here is Tom Stillday. He's from the next res over, Red Lake. And he was the first person who was named chaplain for our state senate who was not from one of the Abrahamic religious traditions. So that was him with his pipe opening up the Senate. He had a great sense of humor too. He said, "I'm praying for politicians." Boy, they needed it. And that was before all of our, more recent dramas and tensions. And who would have thought that something like historic preservation could be so political? But it often is. And it's not just because we need politicians to help us raise money to save an old building, but it touches on culture wars. racial tensions, the fact that we are, more racially segregated now than we were for desegregation, and that all of these things complicate the work that we do in so many different ways. Tom was a lot of fun too. We had him at our university for a graduation banquet speech, and I had been campaigning for a while to get in there, but he was so notoriously long-winded, I also had to pull him aside and say, Tom, we have a lot of awards to hand out, keep it short, couple jokes, focus on the students. And he said, no problem. Got up there and spoke for about an hour and a half. He did it all in Ojibwe, no English at all. And then when he was done, he only said one thing in English. All you people who study Indians, study that. And he went and sat down. I thought that was hilarious. But he had a lot of good points. Even a lot of the history books that were about Native people were written primarily by non-Native people who spent very little time with any of us. And we're looking at what did the, white chaplain in the Army fort write in his journal. That's the primary source document. But how does that get you any Indigenous perspectives about Indigenous history? And it's not just that. It's, of course, the history books, but it's the school curriculum. It's the economic development initiative, the suicide prevention, intervention, the substance abuse intervention plan, and all kinds of other things. For the most part, we're looking at data sets from non-Indigenous people, and then we're confused when we don't get the same result out of that population. And we're wondering why it's so hard to build relationships and collective action around things that have an obvious public good. It's tough, and it's tough especially because it's so hard to talk about, and because you also risk offending someone of, or maybe everyone, of all political stripes, if you even open a conversation. And it also runs counter to our Minnesota NICE training, which is to be so conflict averse that we're communication averse. And so those things sit like an angry bear in the corner of the room, and we pretend it's not there. But addressing that is so critical to being effective with a lot of the things that we're trying to do. I'll give you a minute or two on me, not because that's the most important thing to know, but simply because nobody sees the world the way that it is. We all see the world the way that we are, and we are all different. There's home, epicenter of the universe. Not everybody knows that, but I'm on a mission to preach. A couple folks from my family tree, famously photographed on the left. This guy got the name John Smith later in life, which was ironic, because no connection to the one from Pocahontas mythology. But he was born in the 1700s, and he passed away in 1922. He was pretty close to the record for human longevity, but he was here before there was any white settlement at all. And he was still here after, the soldiers came back from World War I, and the architectural plans for this building were already cemented, and they were ready to start construction 3 years later. And we think this building is old. And I think about the remarkable changes he saw during his lifetime. Without consent, he watched his family and community be the sole occupants of this land, and reduced to having access to a tiny percentage of it. And this is also one of the things that makes it tough when we talk about our shared history. It is complex. America means different things to different people. One story about something like the Constitution would say that this is, second only to the Bible in most awesome documents in human history. That, yes, the definition of we the people didn't include most of the people in this room, because they were women and so forth, or people of color, but that we were able to change the definition of we the people without changing, ripping up the whole Constitution because of its star-spangled awesomeness. And of course, there's another version that says, that Second Amendment wasn't really about freedom, it was was about enabling slave patrols to police black bodies, and that all this language about states' rights was really to enable states, some of which believed owning other humans was a great idea, built their economy around that, and others that believed it was not okay, so they could exist in the same country. And if we're really taking an honest look at both of these very different narratives about what America is, some people want us only to hold up one of those. But the truth is, they are both true. America is both of those things and many other things too. And often our work is like that. I sit on the governing board for the Minnesota State Historical Society that, among other things, steers the campus of Fort Snelling. For the Dakota, Pedote is the birthplace of their people, where the Great Spirit made them and placed them on planet Earth. Of course, we built an army for it on top of that. But it's also a place where, among other things, my grandfather, dark native man, went and enlisted in the U.S. Army so he could go fight in World War II, although he wrote white on his enlistment paper, so he wouldn't be punished or persecuted or denied the opportunity to serve. There are all kinds of stories about even a place. And sometimes we get so focused on the building or the fundraising, we forget about how all of our work affects so many different people in so many different ways. And it's good to build that perspective. This guy on the right was kind of a famous warrior in the Ojibwe world, and I didn't have tools to talk about this when I was going to school, but it did bother me as I got older, that I could go to school for 13 years in a row to learn whatever I needed to be successful in the world, and none of it had anything to do with me. It was kind of like the message that was being delivered by good-hearted people who just wanted to help me succeed, even if the definition of success was kind of narrow. But the message being delivered was, you and yours aren't important, aren't relevant, don't matter. And I remember when we brought on our current executive director at the Historical Society, I said, you know, since the glaciers retreated from Minnesota 11,000 years ago, there's been human history here. And so really all the white guy stuff, that's really pretty new, you know, a couple hundred years back. So as long as our dollar allocations and programming reflect that way, we are going to get along great. You're going to see this chin drop, you know, because imagine how I'm going to navigate this. You know, of course I was kidding in part. But why do we marginalize certain stories and hold up other ones? Which stories or versions of stories deserve primacy of place in our shared public space? And of course there's a tug of war on this stuff now. They're taking down statues commemorating Confederate generals in many parts of the South. Still 6 state flags embolden the stars and bars. And that is being challenged and reconsidered. And it's not just there. It's also here. By the way, one of the other narratives about Fort Snelling is that here in Minnesota, home to Regiment No. 1 on the field at Gettysburg, we also kept 30 black slaves who built many of those historic buildings at Fort Snelling, here in the heart of the Union. Why does that story not get more attention? By the way, there's so much to share. And it doesn't always have to be a big, nasty fight. Just look at foods making people share with the rest of the world. Imagine Italian food absent a tomato. There goes pizza, there goes most of what's on your lunch plate today. You know? I thought that was the center of the Mediterranean diet, and it came from native people. Or imagine potatoes. So critical now to Russian and Irish food that when there was a potato blight, they ironically sent 2 million Irishmen to America. But there couldn't have been a dependency on it until native people so many things. Native people have contributed to the rest of the world. Among other things, founding fathers like Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin studied the Iroquois Confederacy as a model for how can we take these older ideas about democracy and voting from the ancient Greeks and Romans and have independent states part of a shared political entity. And those are ideas borrowed from indigenous confederacies. So just a minute more on myself. These are pictures of my father, who was not native at all. He was actually an Austrian Jewish immigrant. He was a Holocaust survivor. Spoke nothing but German the first 13 years of his life. And he was still living in Vienna some months after the Anschluss, watching his mother scrub the streets at gunpoint, held by a Nazi soldier, watching compulsory divorces between Christians and Jews, being chased around by Hitler Youth, and they had to run for it. And he and his mother, and eventually his father, all got out, as eventually did 2 cousins. Everyone else was killed. They went to Mauthausen, they went to Dachau, they went to camps in Poland. That was it. Well, everyone in our family had a very large family. My father is the only one who had survived and had grandchildren. Last of his line. And I'll take a minor digression here because it's not orthogonal to our conversation today, but I went with him on his first trip back to Austria after World War II, which he took in the middle of the 1980s. And he was hurt and crying and feeling victimized and having a tough time. And I think I felt a lot of those things too. And was very focused on how could this happen? Why did this happen? How could the most literate society on planet Earth come up with this? And just a couple weeks ago, I returned from Austria on my second trip back there. And I was able to see the place with different eyes. By the way, the apartment that my father lived in with his parents at home, still there. My grandfather's store is still there, of course, owned by somebody else now. Their vacation property is still there, and the school we went to. And we visited all of those places, all of which were given away to Aryans when they had to run for it. Instead of as like, a transmission of intergenerational wealth in our family or something like that. And I remember thinking, there's no real way to make any of that right. Like, even the people who, we have some friends in Austria who are saying everyone in Austria has at least one grandparent who's Nazi. And for us, as a married couple, all of their grandparents were Nazis. And as I was sharing with them and listening to their stories, and by the way, they said none of their grandchildren are, I was able to look at and see and appreciate the beauty of that country, which is remarkable, but also the beauty of its people. At the same time that I was able to see the darkness that they visited upon my family and the world. And being able to see both, I think afforded me a true opportunity for healing. It's an ongoing process. America has a great many wounds that it needs to heal from. Genocide of Native people, enslavement of Black people, so many other oppressions. And to afford opportunity for genuine healing for all of us, because by the way, the violence dehumanizes everyone. All the descendants of the Nazis are having a horrible time with that history too. Granted, they got to live and reproduce and feel guilty about it, whereas a lot of other people didn't get to do those things, but it's still hard. The violence still dehumanizes everyone. It still hurts everyone. but making space where we can hear all of that, hold up all of those stories. Germany's been doing a pretty good job of like even putting plaques by the various houses. So-and-so lived here and were removed at this time and sent to this camp. There's a little plaque outside all these different houses. When you walk around, it's like, whoa. You know, but it helps all of us see those things and mitigates the chances that we will do that to one another again. Now, my mother grew up in a little village called Bena, part of the Leech Lake Reservation, population 400, half of them are my cousins. I think for her, things like harvesting wild rice was less a cool cultural pastime and more a necessary means of survival. And when she went to school, she only met one professional Native person ever, and that was the school nurse. So as my parents were getting started, you could say my dad was hitting the restart button, my mother was trying to find a pathway out of poverty, and for a time we had a little cabin that had no electricity or running water. That was me as a tyke, washing up in the creek. We had to man the wash basins in the winter, outhouse, kerosene lanterns. I had never felt poor, I had never had food insecurity, and saw big changes. By the time I hit middle school, my mother had taken her experience at school, only seen one professional Native person ever, the school nurse, and went to nursing school. She thought maybe I could do that. One of her first jobs was working for our tribe's health program, and she thought, wow, Native people are being pushed around, I'm going to do something about that. Went on and became the first female Native attorney in the state of Minnesota. And so I got to grow up watching my mom, Powell Graves, Indian Health Service, Coke bottle eyeglasses, and a suit. She was usually the only woman in court, the only Native in court. And I think among other things that left me feeling like, you know what? We can do stuff. And so the D part of DEI, representation, diversity, not just trying each other's food at the Feast of Nations and saying it all tastes good, and not just token representation. All of those things, the genuine inclusion, makes a huge difference. Now in your work, I bet a lot of you sat on committees. How many of you have sat on a committee where the majority of the people on the committee are people of color? Usually not so many, right? And so that doesn't mean that it's as easy as sending out an invitation. It's complex, especially if you're doing outreach with Native communities who are also running governments and businesses and offices of their own. The tribal chair is probably not going to respond to every single email. Like even at Leech Lake, they're running $100 million in businesses every year. Right? So they can't answer all of their emails, no matter how well attended. There often are tribal historic preservation officers and other people whose job it is to answer calls related to things like historic preservation. But all of these things make a big difference. I think from my mom I learned a lot of things, and I think, you know, in the story of both of my parents, my father is an immigrant, my mother is a Native person, they didn't get everything handed on a silver platter, but they found ways to succeed, and it's one of the most genuinely wonderful things about America, that that's possible, and that those stories are not isolated, but there are many stories like that. And at the same time, I'm still kind of with George Carlin, the old comedian, when he says we call it the American dream because you got to be asleep to believe it. Meaning simply that there are barriers out there and they are not equitably distributed. By race, by gender, and a whole bunch of other things too. There's my crew. There are 9 kids. If any of you like kids, let me know. I'm always looking for babysitters. My wife's in the middle of the pile there. She's got blonde hair and blue eyes, so we joke around and say she's from the Swedish-American tribe. Well represented today, I'm sure. View off the front deck of my house, I kind of feel like Shrek. That's not small. But among other things that had happened, kind of early in our journey, my folks had acquired this piece of property. It did not look like this when they first acquired it. At one point, it probably had been a virgin white pine forest, but But this is what it looked like when they first set up residence. And that's my father on the tractor with my brother. And it had been clear cut and turned into farm fields. Well, he started planting trees. Planted all of the trees in this picture, and it completely transformed the landscape and the ecosystem. Now, just a couple of people, granted they had a child labor force, but what a change. And I really do believe that in historic preservation, that this is not just an occupation for nerds or community organizers, but that it's some of the really important work of our time. In many ways, when we think about the big problems that we're facing today, whether it's climate change, race relations, politics, whatever, a lot of us look at that and think, well, there's not much I can do about it. I'll try to be a decent human. I'll tell my kids to be decent humans. I'll do my bit at work, and I hope it's enough, and it feels like it's never quite enough. But it's not like we need to take this mountain of problems that humans have been making for thousands of years and move that whole mountain right now. It's more like we need to keep planting the seeds, and it can transform the entire landscape and the ecosystem. And every conversation we have in this work is an opportunity to plant the seeds, is an opportunity to include marginalized voices, is an opportunity to reimagine what deserves primacy of place in our public sphere, is an opportunity to build bridges, not just to call people out, but to call people in and to build great things together, to preserve our shared cultural patrimony and do it with sensitivity to indigenous sacred spaces and sovereignty. And the more dignity we muster in our treatment of others, the more we receive in return. It is a reciprocal effort. I like this analogy sometimes as we think about the work. Like if I hold up my finger and say, what is this? I might start a fight unless we clarify in what language. Because in the language of body parts, that is indeed a finger. But in the language of numbers, well, that's a 1. And in the language of space, that's up. So who's right? And of course they're all right. It's a matter of language, context, perspective. And all too often, when we have a project, an initiative, an outreach, an education piece, or you can even say, we're talking about coronavirus or politics in America. Someone's up there saying, this here is a finger, it's not an elbow, it's not a toe. The rest of you, shh. And someone's listening like, what? That's a 1, not a 2. See? You just don't understand. And we totally miss each other. But if we can look at that and see it as a finger and 1 and up and all the other many things that it means, or can mean, that's having multiple perspectives, getting good at it to be multicultural. That's a powerful position to be in. By the way, this is where it makes a difference to have both men and women on your team. Because if you have the all-male gender equity team, it makes people chuckle. You're missing some vital perspectives, and the optics aren't so good. So too is the all-white racial equity team, and all of the other fault lines within our society. When you have representation on your team, you actually influence one another. And in many ways, leadership is influence, and being open to that, as well as sharing yours, is very helpful and powerful. So I'm going to give you, with the little bit of time I have today, a couple of tools to help with some of the DEI stuff as it intersects with your work, and a couple stories that might help point us in future directions as well. So here's a picture of my wife and I. It feels like yesterday when we were getting married. And we see this world so differently. Now, we both live in rural northern Minnesota. We both like to go for a run. Now, when I go for a run, I'm out there, the birds are singing, the sun is shining, this is beautiful, this is wonderful, I'm having a great time. Once in a while, you know, somebody's texting and driving, you can see them swerving around and like, you know. But usually on the other side of the road, I can get out of the way in time. Once in a great while, somebody slows down and gives me a mean look, and I'm like, But for the most part, I really don't feel unsafe. Now, when my wife goes for a run, if somebody slows down to have a good look, or pulls over to the side of the road to deal with their cell phone like they're actually supposed to, well, her heart starts to race. And she's like, oh my God, is this going to be a sexual assault? What's my escape plan? Should I go back now? Should I run into the woods? How do I get out of here? Why did I go for a run today? I could have just gone on a treadmill. It's never enough to stop her from going for a run, but the data says she is actually not as safe as me doing the same thing as me. And our many conversations reveal that she never feels as safe as me doing the same thing as me. And guess what? I happen to be a nice guy. I work at a university. I chair search committees. I make sure at least half the people on every search committee are women, but whether I want it or not, whether I'm oblivious to it or not, I receive this unearned benefit of being a little bit safer in that context. This is one of the things that's tough when we talk about things like gender in America, is that also collectively we are so steeped in the culture of individualism, right? What is your name? What are your degrees? What are your qualifications? What are your accomplishments? Where's your resume? You know, rugged individualism. It's a big part of our culture. And because of that, when we say there's a problem with gender inequity, there's an impulse, whether we defeat it or not, among a lot of men to say, wait a minute, you don't know me, I'm a nice guy. But we're not saying you're not a nice guy. We're not saying you want it this way. We're not saying you are responsible for all of the gender inequity. But we are saying that women aren't safer doing some of the same things that men do. Also, they don't feel as safe doing some of the same things, and that's not okay. And nice guy or not, we need you to lean in, see that, and help us deal with the systems, policies, procedures, and shared culture that are making it so. Right? Same thing happens, by the way, as we deal with race. If we say there's a problem with racism, we think, because of individualism, if there's racism, there has to be a racist. If they're not looking at themselves, they must be looking at me. Wait a minute, I'm a good person. You don't know me. But maybe we're not saying you're a bad person. Maybe we're not saying you have intentional racial malice. We're saying that I don't get to live as long as many people in this room, on average. And it's not because of my bad choices, bad morals, or anything like that, and that's also not okay. There are systems, policies, procedures, patterns. And we can't just interrupt it for a day, we kind of got to disrupt some of these things that are still shaping our entire society. By the way, when the context changes, so does the experience. When we get into cars, because she can be cruising 43 to 30, which is kind of normal for her, running kids to school. And the cop on the corner is like, hey, keep it down. She's never had a citation or been pulled over. And I am like, literally trying to be like driving Miss Daisy. And I've been pulled over so many times, I think I'm up to about 40. I was pulled over twice this past year, given no citation because I was breaking no laws. But I was still pulled over. In the past couple of years, I was pulled over twice for no seatbelt while wearing a seatbelt in broad daylight. I was like, officer, I am wearing my seatbelt. Oh, you are now. You know, there's so many stories. We have a big blended family, and so, you know, I had kids from a previous relationship, and on one of our first camping trips, I had kids in the car. And we get pulled over, and the cops like, you know, license and registration, and how do you spell that last name? And I know it's on all the documents I just handed in, but, you know, get out, you know, I have protection from unreasonable searches and seizures, but if I say that, he's going to get more upset. Fine, I get out. Going through every little thing in the trunk, said, you wait here. It comes up, ma'am, are you okay? Are you sure you're okay? You know, I don't know if he was watching that Jodie Foster film or what, you know, like. And so we were getting a shakedown for about 40 minutes. Finally, nothing wrong, nothing illegal, hands me stuff back, you guys have a nice day. So it takes me a while to pack up the car, take off, and I'm like, are you sure you want to take leave? Because this is not the last time that's going to happen. And it wasn't the last time. And even all of our adult children, all been pulled over by the cops. You know? So the context can shift. Sometimes gender shows up more. Right? We go out to eat, I get the bill 85% of the time. 15% of the time goes in the middle of the table. By the way, most of our servers are women. So we are all socialized to sexism and racism and all the other isms. By the way, I'm friends with our chief of police. He's cool. He comes to our courageous conversations about race. He put Ojibwe language signage on the cop cars. Gun o-shkaah-bay-wis to protect and serve. That's cool. Awesome. This team still pulled me over 40 times, but and so as we think about the things, sometimes it's kind of like this. We're like fish. We can see everything in our environment perfectly, except for the glass bowl that confines us. And here we are swimming along, just trying to keep this great, wonderful building alive, and bonk, we hit the wall. How come most people are mad? How come somebody's, blowing smoke at me about this? I don't get it. Because we can't see everything the way someone else does. No matter how many conversations I have with my wife, I will never experience a run the same way she does. So I have to get curious and ask questions and try to visualize. And so in many ways, what we're trying to do is develop sonar. So we can visualize things we can't actually see ourselves. Sonar is sound waves going out, sound waves coming back. It's a constant conversation. Especially with folks from some of those more marginalized communities who aren't always at the table when they're making the big decisions. So as an example, this kid was a foster kid going to school in Texas, and the school said, oh, well, it's a public school in Texas, so all the boys need a haircut above the collar, which, by the way, was a requirement at that public school. And the foster parents said, you don't need that permanent placement, it's going to be considered assault, it could traumatize him if he cut his hair, it's an important part of their culture. They said, well, if you can verify that he's an enrolled member of a federally recognized tribe and authenticate that this is an important part of their religion, they can petition the school board for a variance. And the point, the only reason to raise it is to say, there probably wasn't someone saying, how can we be mean to natives? There's probably just someone thinking, short hair is normal, or we won't have as many problems with bugs, or it's hot and we don't have air conditioners, or we have problems with bullying, and if all the boys have the same haircut and we'll have fewer problems with that. They're probably thinking something either benign or positive when they came up with that, but it still has this effect. And our historic preservation projects too, we might have the best of intentions, but not realize some of the effects. So it's good to think through and ask questions. What's important to you? What would you like to see this look like? Who else do we need to have in this conversation? And that kind of communication can really do wonders. So I'm going to go through just a couple things, and then we'll make sure that you fly. And Michael said if we need to bump our schedule just a couple minutes so you got time to get to your next breakouts and other rooms, don't sweat it. But this is kind of a famous image that has been shown in many different ways and contexts on the DEI stuff. The reality on the left, that's like, standing on top of all the boxes. That would be me going for a run. And in the hole would be my wife going for a run. Or switch the roles when we're going for a drive. If we have a fair-minded approach, we're saying, we're going to give everybody the same supports. But that doesn't fix the inequities that people are experiencing. If we give people different kinds of supports, that can improve the experience somewhat, but it doesn't change the fact that we still have to treat people differently to try to even out some of the inequities that we're dealing with. So what would it look like to kick that fence down altogether and have a justice frame with the work that we're doing? I think it's important to acknowledge too that this stuff really does freak some people out. It really does. One of the manifestations of colonization is, colonization is about taking one language, culture, and religion and using it to supplant the other ones. So naturally, for everyone speaking in that culture, one of our greatest fears will be fear of our own erasure. And we are now experiencing a fear of white erasure. An unfounded fear, I would say. But it's still very real for a lot of people, and it's good to be sensitive to where they are coming from. To take all the people we want to give a good talking to and make them a good listening to. And to put it into a context. 102 years ago, there was a big push for women's suffrage. And so many men were so freaked out. If women get the right to vote, if God forbid they enter the workforce, they're going to be taking these jobs from men. And men will become poor and they will suffer. And in fact, there were these kind of ridiculous ads against women's suffrage. Right? Like, women will be oppressing men if they get the right to vote. Well, women eventually did get the right to vote. And today, 17% of the world's elected leaders are women. Right? It has hardly overthrown the patriarchy. Women did enter the workforce. And you know what happened? The economy took off. Even though men owned almost all of the stocks and were the primary beneficiaries of that economic expansion. The fears were so unfounded, but they were real to people at the time. And so we have to see where people are at and try to develop a shared language for the inclusion work that we are embarking upon. By the way, equal rights for others doesn't mean less rights for you. That one's not mine. By the way, make no mistake, I am coming for everything my ancestors were denied. But that shouldn't scare anybody. Because by that, I mean I'm coming for longevity. And if I get it, that will not reduce anyone else's longevity. I'm coming for my humanity and my equal rights, and that will not diminish anyone else's. I'm coming for prosperity too, and if I get it, that will not diminish anyone else's. If everybody finishes high school in America, goes to college in America, and gets a job, that means everyone's paying taxes rather than being a leech on the government. In fact, even if your neighbor's house value goes up, guess what? Yours does too. We all do better when we all do better. All right. I'm going to give you just a couple of closing thoughts. I'm going to have to skip through this one because it's kind of fun exercise to do with you. But, we know that the indigenous population of the Americas at the time of contact was around 100 million people. And the population of Europe at the same time was 88 million people. There were incredible and sophisticated civilizations here who also deserve primacy of place in our shared narrative. By the way, if you go to Hawaii, I've been to the Big Island of Hawaii a few times, and they've renamed the roads and the towns and all of that. And it's a way that everybody of all backgrounds says this is something distinctive about this place. And it's not like white people get lost looking for Little Ukulani Boulevard or whatever. And so there are a lot of things we can do. All right. With regard to our community solutions process, it's good to ask, do we have one? Who's represented? Are our materials evaluated for racism? Do we go beyond food, fun, and festivals? Are we getting the right kinds of training, enough of the right kinds of training? Are we thinking about how race will intersect or be impacted by our projects? Are there cultural rules for learning and communicating or doing business that we need to be aware of? These are good questions to ask. It's good to bring in multiple perspectives, but we can't expect all of them to resonate with everybody. Even bringing in a native person and asking them about wild rice harvesting, they might not even have an experience with that. Half of the tribal citizenry lives off reservation. We have different experiences. It's good to allow the community to share their perspectives, but we can't make anyone be our content resource. We can invite them to conversations. It's good to be sensitive to different cultures, but we can't expect everyone to exhibit those. I'll just point you to a couple of other tools and resources that may be helpful. By the way, when we're done here and you're scurrying off to your next sessions, I've got cards, feel free to grab one. I've got lists of resources on my website for free, including lists of Indigenous authored books and things like that. I've got a YouTube channel, lots of shorts, how to do work with tribes, how to find resources, different things like that that may be helpful to you as you extend that. Questions sometimes come up, should we do land acknowledgements or not? Bottom line, I'd say, do them, but just don't stop there. And so a lot of projects and efforts and institutions are starting to do that. And as we wrestle with, the public goods, and there's so many, these are on our minds. This is why you got into the profession. We preserve buildings and places. We educate the public. We conduct research. We publish things. We develop connections in the community. We can get support from and give support to tribes and other communities that are sometimes marginalized, financial support, facilities, all kinds of things. And we have to be aware that sometimes our projects can cause harms too. Could be objectification, for example, of tribal cultures and people, and turning their sacred spaces, objects, or bodies, or graveyards into objects of public curiosity rather than something sacred in its own right. We can become a control apparatus for tribal artifacts, whether they're funerary or cultural, and also for tribal people who want to access their own sacred sites. We can sometimes unknowingly or knowingly be engaged in cultural appropriation. We can be competitors for financial resources, and we can sometimes be powerful resistors to tribal sovereignty and control. By the way, in the state of Minnesota, there are shared compacts regarding governance of public spaces like the Chippewa National Forest, Wild Rice Refuge, and many other things like that. And so there are some ways that we can position ourselves to orchestrate positive change. Of course, in 1990, we had the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, which governs funerary items in public spaces. It does not provide the same protections in private spaces, and sometimes we have to work out cooperative ventures to expand those protections. There have been a lot of repatriations. White Earth, for example, had 2 ceremonial drums repatriated that reinvigorated their ceremonial drum culture that had not been active since the 1940s. That all happened after NAGPRA as a result of repatriations. So sometimes it has profound effects. I was just in a meeting, probably not even a year ago. There was a land parcel repatriated to the Lower Sioux community. The tribal chairman was on the call with us, and he was saying, my dad said we would never, ever, 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 ever do this. We just did it. And he was crying. And you should have seen the stodgy board of the Minnesota Historical Society choking up Red Lake with him. And that did not remove any acreage from public conservatorship. We had offsets with another site that enabled an expansion rather than a reduction in publicly accessed lands at the same time that we sensitively attended to a tribal need. Some of our Jedi Council in the last. The Minnesota Historical Society has been publishing books on Native stuff, and we started working with these folks. By the way, it was one of the craziest meetings of my life. I went to it, they said, yeah, we've got some overages for grants. We want to do something with language and culture and historic preservation. What can we do? And I said, well, how much is your overage from grants? And they said, well, it's like $14 million. I almost spit my teeth out. I had a long list of stuff. I was like, we should do this and that. We should do a bunch of new books and a literacy initiative. We should do Rosetta Stone for Ojibwe and set these guys up to teach people our language for hundreds of years to come. And we should really talk about what's going on inside the Awesiinyensag Museum. And they're looking at all this stuff. And they said, okay, well, let's do all of it. Yeah, so we had our first 5 books released. First year Rosetta Stone just came out, and we do another year every year for the next 6 years. And Joe Naquanaby, who was one of the elders pictured here on the very far left end, we had to work through the pandemic. He had a brother and a sister who died. And we were at the launch event for these books, and I thought he'd say, this was the hardest time of our life. He got up there and he said, this was a tough time, but seeing all these young people coming around and seeing all of the support from the Historical Society and other organizations and seeing what we were able to accomplish, I think doing this work has been the happiest time of my life, which is a pretty amazing statement. So as we reach out and connect and give back, that heals us, as well as the people that we are seeking to serve. It's not just an act of charity. All right, I gotta finish this up before I get all kinds of stuff. We were working on this in the Minnesota State Capitol, and these are some of the questions that are good to ask. What stories deserve primacy of place in historic preservation? Who should tell those stories? And how should we go about the work? There are no simple answers. I could recommend reading The Anatomy of Peace. I could share a family story where we are on our family property, and one of the customs when a baby's born is we put the placentas in the woods. We bury them by maple trees, which is a tree of life. And every spring we're out there and the kids are making offerings by these maple trees where their placentas are buried. It's kind of a sense of connection to the land and to history and to family and community tradition. And so there are a lot of ways that we can enable that, no matter what kind of projects and efforts we're working on. I like, and I'll leave you with the Margaret Mead quote, never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. So who would those thoughtful, committed citizens be? And I'm looking at them right now. I believe in you guys. I believe in this work. I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you so much for tuning in today. Be great.